Ladies and gentle beings, welcome to Memes Testing, where I play games wrong and see if they're still completable. Today we'll be diving through the memories of a leech merchant in Thymesia. This is a Souls-like game that has been out for a bit and definitely gives some Bloodborne vibes. This was requested by a good friend of mine in the latest poll, so let's get Spooky Month started with a dose of introspection and body horror. The challenge that was suggested was to complete the game with no potions and without parrying. That's a good base challenge, but let's bump it up a bit to no consumables at all, and let's bump up the no parrying to no use of the sword. That includes parrying, blocking, and attacking. That cuts every single thing the player can do, except moving, dodging, and using the claw/plague weapons, as the claw is what you use to steal them. That brings me to the gameplay loop that we'll be playing for most of the game. This is going to include a charging attack with the claw to reave a plague weapon, and then we have a one-time use of an attack that is unique to that enemy. We can gain shards of these weapons to eventually unlock them for permanent use, but we'll hold off for that as long as possible. The tutorial itself is where we'll begin, and this will not be counted, as the game will literally force me to learn every single one of these mechanics, but as soon as we reach the point with the first mini-boss, the game has taught us everything it can, and from this point on, we will use only the before stated methods of dealing damage. Speaking of the first mini-boss, I was not ready for the enemy to be using heavier weapons. Everything up until now has been using the equivalent of a butter knife, but this guy can absolutely pancake us with every single one of his hits. After 5 or 6 attempts at failing horribly, I did realize that I was able to steal his greatsword. However, this does change things quite dramatically in our favor. This is where I should probably go over one of the many unique mechanics in this game, as health is not exactly health for all of the enemies. When we damage an enemy with most weapons, they will have a lingering green health bar called wounds. If left alone for a significant period of time, the enemy will regenerate any health lost up until the maximum wounds shown. This leads to a more offensive playstyle, but that is my preferred way of playing, so that's fine by me. This is where the claw supposedly comes in, as it is designed to deal much more damage to wounded sections of health. However, we are mainly going to be dealing damage with the claw early game, so this doesn't necessarily matter to us until we start getting plague weapons. On to the tutorial boss itself, and surprisingly, it went well for a little while. His attacks were fairly easy to dodge, and the weapon they have is actually really good when we steal it, so I was feeling pretty good about this until I was 3-shot and then a cutscene began to play. Guess we're following that old Souls-like tradition. Fair enough. When we wake up, we'll be met with a ghost child that's a little less spectral when we last seen her, and she will tell us that we have to remember why we are here. So we jump on into our memories to see what we're doing. Our first memory is in the Sea of Trees, a demonic circus filled with mutated carnies and clowns, overseen by the circus master Odor. This leads us to walking up a disease-filled tree filled with plagued fighters and various mini-bosses along the way, including this fight with a clown that you've been seeing on screen for the last little bit, where we discover that this game has a Makiri counter similar to Sekiro, surprisingly another feature that we can use, as we only need to dash forward into the enemy. But until we gain more talents, all that we can use this for is dodging, but later we can have a follow-up attack with the claw, which makes it actually fairly useful. Up to the top of the tree, and we find Odor himself, and oh dear. Wait, please. No. You know, maybe I just didn't have enough health. Let's level up and... Oh no, that's barely any additional health. Maybe 10 vitality will make this easier. I mean, it's the first boss in the game. Surely it's just me, right? This is the part of our story that gets a little bit sad, as I checked in every few levels, and I could not beat the first boss of this game with only the claw and reeved weapons. This is due to the weapon we reeve from Odor being miasma, which, while it does moderate damage, it will leave a buff on us that allows us to dodge more, which is lovely, but this applies additional time before we can steal another. This, along with the 24-second cooldown, means that we can get in one attack every 45 seconds. And as this boss kills me in under 8 attacks, I don't think it's feasible to avoid him for around 20 minutes just to beat what I will later find out is only phase 1. So after grinding and checking in every 5 levels or so, I realized that there's a level 50 cap in this game. At this point, I realized I had no other real option but to unleash the restriction I had set on myself and start using plague weapons. Oh, you thought I was going to lift one of the other restrictions? No, I'm still going to be doing this with all those. I just figured I'd try and do it with an additional restriction just for me because I have several problems. Even with a fully upgraded axe, this fight is not a joke. While I now have some recourse and can actually deal damage consistently, as not only does this have a 10 or so second cooldown, but I now have to deal with the fact that our energy to use these weapons is limited. But due to one of the talents I have taken, we can also convert health into energy. This leads to a much more sketchy playstyle, as it doesn't really matter if he can 8-shot us, because we are almost always 1 or 2 hits away from being dead by the second phase. After another 24 attempts or so, I was able to actually beat this boss with only plague weapons and dodging. But I hope to hell this is not the scaling that I'm expected to deal with in this game, as if the bosses continue to be like this, it is just simply not possible. Next up we have the Royal Gardens, and it is so nice to see a change in atmosphere, as not only have I been farming in that plague-ridden tree for the past 6 hours, but we now have a new atmosphere, and yes, that comes with new enemies. After looking around for anything that could be useful, I do spot the second enemy of this area using a bow, and with that I decide that we should have at least one option that is ranged. Another while into the Royal Gardens, we do find these gardeners holding scythes, and I'll be honest, I'm very basic when it comes to this kind of weapon, as I've always had a soft spot for scythes and sickles in these types of games, probably dating back to all that dead angle PvP I used to do in Dark Souls 1, but who knows. These two weapons are going to be our primary for the remainder of the game, as the bow is self-explanatory, as any attack we can get in without the enemy being able to hit us is a bonus, as well as when we fully upgrade it, we'll actually apply a damage over time effect, dealing only damage to the white section of the health bar, which, while nice, is definitely not the health bar I have problems depleting. The scythe is even more useful, in my opinion, as not only can it deal damage in large sweeping areas, but we also gain a small amount of health back, which is our only method of healing outside of the 10 or so we get from the claw every now and again. This is not only useful to recover from mistakes, but it also means that when we use our health to pay for a weapon attack, it is essentially a discount or better depending on who and how many targets we hit. This is going to be somewhat relevant now, but later in the game where we can chain 2 of these attacks together at a reduced cost is going to be our primary method of healing. This place isn't much to write home about outside of those 2 weapons, as there is a garden section and a blood-filled library, and on the face of it that is pretty cool sounding, but realistically that library is about 30 seconds of walking from the entrance to the boss of the area, as the bonfire is literally in front of that boss, we're just going to be smashing our faces against the Hanged Queen. And compared to the first fight, this is an unbelievably more fun boss. As I think it's due to the scaling of it, it reminds me much more of a Monster Hunter boss than anything else. But the boss itself moves at quite a remarkable speed. Unlike the first, it only has one phase, but the only other thing it does of note is healing itself, which, as long as we keep on top of her, even with our restrictions, the healing is going to be minimal at best. Speaking of healing, when we reave the target, we can also get the ability to heal ourselves for around 200 health, which isn't super good in a normal run, but when we only have what we have, this is the equivalent of 1 or 2 scythe attacks, and is going to be healing us for about 50% of our total health when we need it. The fight itself is a huge step down in difficulty from the first, as the only real attacks we have to worry about are the ranged attack, which is often the first one the opponent starts the fight with, a jump attack, which can be easily dodged, and a secondary attack she can do while flying, which causes most of the area to explode and you have to run away from. This one deals by far the most damage and has killed me more often than I would like, as tunnel vision is definitely something I need to work on. But in the end, we dealt with this boss in about 6 attempts. Even at max level, the attempts we had done on Odor were in the triple digits. So this is definitely a step down, and honestly I'm kind of thankful for it. Next up is the Hermes Fortress, and this is giving me some Dark Souls 2 vibes, but just like the previous area, not much to write home about. Mainly just walking to the next shortcut and opening a door or kicking down a ladder, and then proceeding on. I feel like I was expected to do a lot more with the enemies here, but the corridors and buildings are just so wide that you can walk past them without any kind of issue. After looking at the options the enemies dropped for reaved weapons, I decided to just forgo everything and full steam ahead until a boss appeared. This was the point that I realized that you could probably beat this game in about 3 hours if you just beelined every single boss, because it's only been about 45 minutes since I beat Odor, and I'm already in the second to last area. Granted, this isn't a bad thing, as the game is not going for a ridiculous price, but I feel like they overcompensated the difficulty on the first boss by quite a bit, solely just so that people would get stuck there and go past the 2-hour limit for the refund on Steam. I say this because in hindsight, the first boss is a magnitude harder than any other boss, and this is an excellent segue to Varg. Varg is the meant to lose fight from the tutorial, as unlike every other boss which had some kind of lead up, I accidentally wandered into this fight, and with how the track record is going, at this point you would probably expect that I was smashed immediately. But that wasn't the case. This boss's attack patterns are definitely Pursuer-esque. I'm looking at you again, Dark Souls 2. And the only real issue I had with this fight was that during the times the undodgeable attacks happened, you're supposed to parry. Obviously, that's just free damage for the enemy, as we have no option to defend, unless we're on the other side of the map somehow. But at this point, he's just a dude with a sword, and it's not exactly an engaging fight, just a lot of slow arcing strikes followed by some quick ones to try and take you off your guard, but the dodging available in this game is superb. In the talent tree, you have a choice between short and long dodges, dictating the time and length that both these take, and you can also gain the ability to double dodge. Unless you need to outrange the boss in a very short amount of time, short dodging is almost always going to be the best option. This is due to the fact that you can have iframes on demand and almost always follow it up immediately, as the iframes do not last the entire time of the dodge. For the long dodges, they are mainly for gaining distance. Using this is fairly easy to avoid large combos of attacks from enemies such as Varg, and it isn't very hard, but it does look pretty impressive in hindsight. After we take down the Pursuer, we move on to the final fight. I'm not joking. There are 3 mandatory bosses in this game, and then you're on the final fight. This is what led me to think that the first boss was inflated in difficulty in order to pad runtime. But it was also at this point that I realized you can actually teleport back to the previous areas and continue to try and remember what you were doing, which is a neat-ish concept, but it does mainly come off as reusing the same levels for busy work, as the first side quest is destroying these plague pustules, something I was doing already in the first level, but apparently there's a few extra that were gated off by the terrain, so they move the map around a little, and you defeat 5 or 6 of these, and the ghost lady calls it a day. Not exactly a tantalizing quest. For the second optional quest, we run around collecting notes. Thematic, sure, we are an alchemist, but not super engaging. We literally run around collecting shinies off the ground until, again, the ghost lady appears and says, "Good job, let's leave." While this is a unique way of dispensing lore, it's very heavy-handed. They already scatter these collectibles around the area that you can pick up naturally while you're going through the game, but the idea that there is literally 1 of 5 parts of this entire level dedicated to just picking up notes is ridiculous. The extra few notes could be hidden behind a locked door, or on a mini-boss enemy, or any number of things that are just slightly off to the side and gated in a way that isn't just replay the level again, you idiot. This is where things picked up, at least at first, because the third optional part of this area was refighting Odor. But this time, he has taken some alchemical concoction, and this is where the body horror begins. As after injecting it, tentacles begin to burst from inside of him, and the fight becomes much more erratic. This is not what made me think something was wrong initially. After all, I'm a huge fan of body horror. The thing that got me was the difficulty of this fight. This is supposedly the same person that had turned me inside out over 120 times, and they are now in their truest form. The pinnacle of human evolution. This literally took me 2 attempts. I can't even blame the fact that I had worse weapons back then, as the previous attempts where I was stealing miasma was actually pretty useful as long as I had other plague weapons, as the defensive buff you get allows you to dash indefinitely during that time. You are basically immortal for 12 to 15 seconds while you have time to think and plan your next attack. Not great for damage, but other plague weapons can fill that role. The plague weapon we have this time is those tentacles, which locks you into a long animation for basically no damage and almost always ends with us being turned inside out. But that is just us taking damage due to a bad weapon. Not only is this second fight easier, but we have less good tools to work with that are given from the boss. In the end, the pinnacle of evolution was defeated, and I was left with a kind of hollow feeling, which was almost immediately removed upon seeing the next area. As soon as you get into the next area, you drop down and there was a massive demonic tree, like spilling out of every orifice. Just truly the coolest enemy I've seen in this game so far. And then I'm going to say 2 words that make any Souls fan very, very sad. Ancient Wyvern. This entire area is a boss fight, based solely on the fact that we get to the top of this area and then one-shot the boss. Sadder still, most of his attacks are so slow that once he attacks once, you can run forward and break whatever is blocking your path, and then just run on to the next obstacle and repeat. The only reason I died once in this fight is because I got impatient and tried to climb a ladder with an enemy still alive, and they murdered me for doing so. On my second attempt, I just made sure to bait them away and made it through the entire area in about 90 seconds. The coolest boss so far literally dies to a trigger press. At this point, I decided to at least attempt the final area instead of going on to the optional content for the Royal Gardens and the Hermes Fortress. But at this point, I realized once I decided to teleport in that the final area was literally just a boss fight. Granted, the coolest fight in the game, both visually and thematically, as soon as you get there, you are met with a massive birdcage, which when you approach, there is another copy of you sitting on one of the many bonfire chairs that this game has. Conceptually, this is actually quite lovely, as you've been traveling through your own memories this entire time, trying to figure out what you were doing to try and cure this plague. The idea of you being the only thing stopping you from completing your goal actually makes sense in this situation. That being said, this fight annoyed me to no end, but it's probably not for the reasons that you think. Design-wise, I love this fight. The other Corvus has every single weapon that you do, which, if this was a fair fight, would be kind of fun. But not only do they switch between every single plague weapon and we can only have two, but they also have every single talent ability simultaneously. When we're selecting talents, as I said before, you can have long dodges, short dodges, long claw, short claw, different playstyles. They can have everything simultaneously. This is a neat idea, as it could cover every single playstyle that you could have had up until this point. But it does leave me frustrated after some losses, where he would swap from doing one set of skills to another in rapid succession. If this was something we could do also and set presets, I don't think it would have bothered me as much. With this supposedly being us confronting ourselves, breaking that established rule just kind of annoyed me a little bit. Personally, if I was to make this, I would have run off of a talent-based system that the game already has access to. Personally, if I was going to be making something like this, I would have used the information the game already has in the talent-based system, and then just make sure that that boss has access to those specific talents. In my opinion, would be a better choice, as the other Corvus would be a true mirror of you, but I digress. This is also the point in the game where I realized how good feathers were, and it kind of saddened me that I was ignoring them this entire time. I still won't be using them, but they are really cool. I mean, there's an attack that Corvus does where he throws a feather at us and then teleports to us and does a quick attack with the claw. That would have been so useful 5 or 6 dozen times during the first boss, but again, not something that I can really use, at least not this run. One other really neat thing about this fight is the fact that up until now, when we steal a weapon, the weapon we can steal from an enemy is set. But this isn't the case for Corvus. As he also uses plague weapons, whatever the last weapon he used was, is the one that we steal. Which is a really nice change of pace, as it allows me to ignore the scythe and bow that we're still using, and allows us to try and steal a hammer or greatsword, or just anything we don't currently have equipped. As if I steal something I already have, there won't be any change, as they share the same cooldown. But we can get so much more value out of stealing one of these other weapons, as it allows for massive burst damage, and in the case of the greatsword, some wonderful crowd control. Phase 2 was also a nice surprise, as the AI got much more aggressive and the plague weapon uses became much more into what I was using them for, as the other Corvus now has the ability to use secondary moves, which is how I've been using these weapons so far, as this essentially doubles the amount of use that he has at his disposal, and it led to a much more hectic fight. On top of this, the other Corvus can now parry. as this honestly shocked me when it happened, as up until now, I don't think a single enemy in this entire game has parried me. But as you can see here, after a good amount of smacking my head against this wall, I was able to beat this game with only dodges, plague weapons, and the claws. Honestly, I'm kinda torn on this one, as the game is visually a delight. But the execution feels a bit inconsistent, and the boss design looks amazing. But the difference in difficulty and where these bosses are placed is a little bit egregious. If there was any ability to change paths in this game even slightly, like some of the earlier Dark Souls games, if I had even one other option I could take instead of progressing towards Odor, that would be fantastic. I'm not asking for complete free roam like in Elden Ring. I'm just saying having a second option for a boss, being able to get to a second area. This is all memory based, we could move on. But the way it's set up, it does just feel like they have put a roadblock in front of most players, just to burn time. Even accounting for the fact that I was limiting myself incredibly heavily, the fact that this boss can kill you in a single combo with a good number of points in vitality means that if you are not on point with your dodges, the fight can end in literally 2 seconds. Outside of the final fight, this is not the case for any other boss I fought. As Odor being the first and only option to fight when starting the game is ridiculous. And I will reiterate, I do understand that some of the difficulty is coming from my playstyle, but every single place that I looked online about this game mentioned the first boss being the hardest. Every single source I can find was mainly asking how to beat this specific boss. This is not something where it is only my opinion that has been colored by my choices. This is a opinion that is shared, from what I can see, almost universally. But with that, we will leave this at being possible. If you're looking for a shorter Souls-like experience, and you do like the aesthetic, I would recommend it. As long as you can get past the fact that the first boss is going to be taking up a good chunk of your time, and that there will be a massive drop-off in difficulty after that first area. All in all, it was okay, but it did feel like it was giving me a lot of busy work. If you're still here, I appreciate your time, and if you think it was well spent, a like or subscribe goes a long way to letting me know. If you have any suggestions for other challenges, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you when we do the next thing.